Thank you. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the NYC Complexity Lounge. We're newly renamed from the former NYC Complexity and Knevin group, but now we're a lounge, which is awesome. We have guests today, but I'm going to give a little spiel first. I'm Jocko, and over there in one of those panes is Barbara. Wave, Barbara. Our group is devoted to the discussion of complexity, primarily in human systems or anthro-complexity and or organizational change, but we are also interested in all sorts of other forms of complexity, whether you're interested in things out of like the Santa Fe Institute or computational complexity or ants or whatever it is that you're interested in, and it has the word complexity in it, we like to talk about it. And if you like to talk about it as well, and you're interested in talking to the group about it, please reach out to Barbara or myself or Barbara, and she will get back to you. So that's my little spiel, and I'm going to hand it over to Barbara for the introduction of our guest. Barbara.
Thanks, Jocko. Am I unmuted? Yes. Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome. I will remind you that this is being recorded, so that if you do not want to appear in the video, please turn off your cameras right now, and please mute yourselves. During Greg's presentation, I will ask that you try to keep the chat to a minimum, just because I personally find it very distracting, and I think others do as well. So with that said, we are delighted tonight to welcome Gregory Vigneaux. Greg is interested in how we experience and manage complexity around incidents, and his work is founded on his experience fighting forest fires around the country with the U.S. Forest Service and the National Park Service Hotshot crews. He has a master's degree in emergency management, and he has worked for FEMA, consulted for Save the Children, and co-founded the ADAPT Institute. So with that, I will say, take it away, Greg.
All right, thank you very much for that introduction. And thank you all for being here with us this evening. This is going to be what I hope is a really interesting talk. It has been in my mind for a few years, but I've never really had the audience or the venue to have the reason to actually put it together and go present on this topic. So when Barbara and I got in touch, she said you can pick a complexity topic of your choosing, I immediately jumped to this talk that has been germinating in my head for some time now. So what I want to do tonight, my goal is to get you all really excited about frames. I want frames to be an exciting thing. And I want you also to be very excited about the philosophy of framing, the dynamics and processes that go into creating a frame. So it's a very philosophical talk in that it asks, or it looks around and sees and reflects on how we practice around complex systems. And the takeaways are equally philosophical in that they invite you to think about how you work and operate around and cope with complex systems. So this, of all the talks I've ever given, this is by far the most practical title I've ever come up with, in that everything that I'm going to talk about is in the title, albeit a little bit out of order. So the first thing I want to do this evening is I want to talk just briefly about complex systems in a way that may be quite fundamental to many of you, but I want to get us all, I want to build a narrative and get us all on the same page and thinking about the same aspects of complex systems. Then I want to get into this topic of framing and what that means and what that has to do with complex systems and what its sort of relevancy is to how we cope and function and manage complexity. Then I want to build that conversation into big questions about reality, objectivity, subjectivity, what is our relationship to a complex system, and then funnel that through to the discussion of language, which is how we sort of bring these systems forth. And lastly, I want to end up hopefully at this topic of flow, which I think we can get some new frames, some new language for creating frames for complex systems out of. So a lot to do. It's a bit of a magical mystery tour. There's a lot of interesting quotes and cool rocks to look under and see what's there. So if I can get to the next slide here. Okay, before moving on, I thought this was fitting, especially because we lost Humberto Maturana earlier this May. If this is your first time hearing about that, I'm sorry. He died in May of pneumonia in his mid-90s, which was devastating for me. I've been following his work, studying everything that has been available in English and translating some of his work that's only available in Spanish and trying to understand his philosophy. Equally important this evening is the work of Paul Cilliers. I've heard it pronounced Cilliers. I'm not entirely sure that's true, so I'm going to just call him Paul. He died very prematurely of cancer, and his work, of course, is equally important to the study of complex systems. His book, Postmodernism and Complexity, is a keystone in my work, as are a collection of his journal articles. So I just wanted to take a moment out of this talk and elevate these two giants whose shoulders I'll be squarely standing on this evening. So in terms of takeaways, I want to get here tonight. I want to get to a space where these principles of framing complex systems are obvious, a place where they make sense, a place where we can read them and walk away with them and have them sort of resonate. I'm not going to go through them now. I'm going to discuss them at the end of the, sort of towards the end of the talk, and have them go over what they mean and how we can use them. But they all come from the literature. The walk we're going to take through books this evening is where they find their source. So to open it up, I wanted to start in a quite maybe obvious location and talk about this, just talk about systems for a minute. This is by far the most concise and beautiful definition of a complex system I have ever come across. This comes from a paper titled The Nature of the Laws of Nature by Maturana. It's sort of a summation of all of his work. And he says that a system is a collection of elements interconnected in a matrix of relations such that any action on one element affects other elements in it. So there's this thing that I think we get in a lot of complexity research, where if you affect one area of the system, other areas will be effective. I think the simplest version is if you step on a cat's tail, where will the yowl come out of? But I think we can put this into sort of the parlance of complex adaptive systems, or complex systems which we might be more familiar with, and say that adaptation by one agent or group of agents in one area of the matrix of relations leads to adaptations by other agents elsewhere. So there's this matrix, and within it are all these agents joined together by it that are continuously zigging to one another's zag, and events taking place in what we might call the environment. So there's this ongoing adaptation within this matrix of relations. And I'm bringing this up because I want to build towards this notion of temporality that I think complex systems have, that's very important, especially when we start talking about frames. The matrix as it exists at its present is a product of its history. It is diachronic, as Paul would say. It has a long comet tail that extends into the system. And in doing so, to understand its presence, you really need to have an understanding of its history, all the zigs and zags that sort of led to its present disposition. And it is disposed at any instance towards certain futures and away from others. So it's a very temporal thing. It has a past that has contributed to its present, and that present is disposed towards having futures. So the temporal horizon is then an important thing to consider when framing a complex system, a term that I'm going to introduce formally in the next slide here. The takeaway here is that some of the zigs and zags in the system's history are more important than others to understanding the system at present and where it will head to. I think American politics over the past few years is an enormous example of that, and that some zigs have been more important than others. So this is a bit of a long slide. I want to take just a minute. And again, this is probably rudimentary for many of you, but just want to get on the same footing with you. Paul is saying here that a complex system is constituted through a number of nonlinear reactions. So this matrix of relations that Maturana is envisioning, those relations that tie the agents together are nonlinear, meaning that one agent adapting to something in its environment or other agents can lead to an effect at a much greater distance than the cause originated, and it may be disproportionate, meaning larger or smaller to that initial cause. There's another sort of take on nonlinearity that I think is really interesting and important. And it comes from the work of Fritjof Capra, and we were actually just talking about him before we all got on here. He's a really interesting physicist and has written some really interesting work on complex systems. But he says that nonlinearity occurs when we look at the system. When we look at the network of relations that are holding the entities in the system together, it extends in all directions. It's going sort of every which way. So it's not as maybe Maturana describes like a matrix, like a perfect, like it's a symmetrical matrix, but rather it's moving in all directions. And as such, you cannot separate it from its environment. It's in all directions. It is entangled with what we might call its environment. So given this size, given the expanse of the network of relations that we're looking at, Paul says it is not possible to give a complete and analytical and formal description of a complex system. He says that it's not possible. There's too much complexity to try to fit into something. We simply can't wrap our arms around everything that we would need to in order to generate a formal description. So he says what we have to do is we have to frame the system in a certain way when we want to describe it. And we frame the system by describing it in a certain way for a certain reason. So that's the definition of frame that I want to be going with here this evening. We frame the system by describing it in a certain way. So we use certain language to talk about this system that it would be too big to handle otherwise. And we use certain language and we follow a certain strategy and we frame that system in a particular way. So this is a little bit more of a vague definition of a frame. If you look at the work of Kees Dorst, he wrote a book called Frame Innovation, Create New Thinking by Design. He defines a frame as an organizational principle or a coherent set of statements that are useful to think with. He points out that frames are intrinsic, that we cannot formulate or approach a problem without framing it. We cannot not have a frame. So I think that's something very similar to what Paul is saying, is that you have to have a frame. You have to have a frame to be able to deal with a complex system. So this has been haunting me for quite some time when discussing frames, and I want to just put this out there, and hopefully we can discuss it later.
Can I just interrupt you for 1 second?
Of course.
Your sound is very uneven.
Is it? Now, we tried to fix that earlier. Let me see if I can move my computer closer.
That might be the solution. Yeah, because I think it depends on how you're moving in and out from the microphone. And
all right, I've got it a little bit closer to me now.
We'll see how it goes.
Okay, keep me posted, and we can always get back into that. So what I wanted to say just then was, when we go to frame a complex system in this intentional, very deliberate way, when we break out the Post-it notes and the easels and the notebooks, I think we need to acknowledge that we have already framed that system in some way. We have already, something has to be there for us to frame. And I think we get into a discussion of the biology of cognition and maybe even neurophenomenology. But the point is that when we go to frame something pre-exists our intentional process of framing. We are not starting from scratch. Something is already there. And I'm bringing this up just as an aside and as an point for something for us to consider later, that we're not starting from scratch. Something pre-exists our intentional work around frames. So Meadows is great. And I've always liked this quote from her when she sort of addresses this topic of boundaries. She says that systems rarely have real boundaries. And then she says in, I think, stronger language towards the end, that there are only boundaries of word, thought, and perception and mental models. So what she's doing here is something that I think that Paul does and other people do. Stowell and Welch in a manager's guide to, I think, systems thinking, they say that, without some sort of manufactured boundary, we would have to deal with the universe and everything in it. I think is an interesting quote. Or if we want to model a complex system, we would have to model life, the universe, and everything in it, because there are no real boundaries. Everything is connected and not neatly. And I think that is an extreme view that I want to inhabit this evening, just for a short while, and talk about sort of this one system approach, this total holism, because it helps us to sort of step back in this process of making frames. It makes things a little bit clearer. But Maturana cautions against holism, as I think a lot of people have, and says that can become the new reductionism, which is an interesting turn of phrase, because holism is trying to be, systems thinking is trying to be more towards viewing the world in a holistic manner. But he says reducing something to the whole, flattening it to the system, is just another form of reductionism. So the 2 points I want to make here are that there's one has sort of already been made, is that when we make frames, when we formulate a description of the system that we want to talk about, when we want to take a bite out of this massive system and deal with only a bit of it and generate a frame that we can see that system through, we are drawing boundaries. These are boundaries of word, boundaries that are formulated through our descriptions. And in doing so, we have spatially sort of confined that system. We have said, this is what we're going to listen to, and this is what we're not going to listen to or pay attention to. And the same thing happens when we bind them to a particular here and now. We're saying that this is important and this event is not important. So we're making decisions about what goes into what we care about and what doesn't. And the only way, I think, to check and see if you were correct is to engage with that frame, to put that frame in use and sort of see what happens as sort of an experiment. Because there's no way to sort of ahead of time see if you've made the correct deliberations, the correct judgments on what fits into that frame or not. There's also another consideration that I think is very social and very cultural, and that is, how big of a frame can you create? How long of a description can you create? How much complexity can you fit in there? How much can be communicated? How much time do you have before people stop listening? But how much time do you have before your boss stops listening to you as you're trying to communicate your frame of the system, of the problem, to him? So there's a social element here too that sort of dictates or defines how big our boundaries can be, how much our frame can sort of encompass, and how much we can share with other people. If you're in the early hours of an incident, say in my instance, a wildfire, you don't really have a lot of time to communicate like some big, beautiful description of the complex system that you're operating in. No, it's going to be very short. It's going to be limited to sense making and very, very short. So it's not just what you're drawing and sort of how you're cutting up the system. It's also the expectation of how you're going to deliver it. How is it, what is the functional length of a description to communicate to somebody else in your context? What is operable? What can you operationalize before you have to cut it down or make it smaller? I think we'd all like to, when we're working with systems and we have a project that we're working on, would like to deliver some long description and frame it in this long, sort of complex way. But I've run into the experience more than once where that can't be communicated. It just can't go anywhere. So when we think about boundaries, let's think about how we cut up the world, but also how we're going to communicate it. So I like this a lot. I think that this is kind of a humbling slide. This comes from a paper from Richardson, Cilliers, and Lissac, and it's called Complexity, a gray science for the stuff in between. And so this paper moves from the idea of there being one system in the world to our interacting with it. And as we interact with it, we generate what he calls partial complex systems, which is a little bit of a kick in the pants, honestly. I like to say I'm working with complex systems or researching a complex system, but he says, no, it's not a completely autonomous entity. It is just a part of a completely autonomous entity. You're not dealing with the whole thing. So there's this, I thought the scissors were a fitting image because you're cutting out something. It doesn't stand on its own. So this is taking it one step further. If you've not read from Edgar Morin or Edgar Morin, I've also heard it pronounced. There's some, I have a reference list built out at the end of this. These slides are already on my slide share. If you follow the link to my website, you can pick that up there. He's a beautiful writer. He writes about complexity in a very experiential way, very poetic way. And he's saying here that when we're creating these partial complex systems, we're sort of cutting up the phenomenal universe. That is to say, the perceptible by the senses or our immediate experience. We're cutting up our surroundings. And if we do this sort of wrong, it flows out in systems that don't make any sense. Or on the contrary, we follow the as a skillful butcher does, the outline of the joints. So what he's saying here is that there needs to be some sort of sensibility, like the musician's ear, which is listening to the system and hearing the system, whereas like the maybe aggressive mind only recognizes that one theme, that one system it's trying to create in cutting up this phenomenal, everything is connected world. I think that there is a lot to be said about that. I think this cutting up is linguistic. I think it's through descriptions. I think that's how we do it. I don't think we're doing it necessarily through drawing on an easel. I think we're doing it through describing a complex system. That's where we're sort of cutting the meat, as we might say, given this quote. So it doesn't necessarily have to be like an overtly like intentional act, but by talking about a system, you've already cut up the world that is around it. Okay, so this is sort of one of the last slides in this discussion on complex systems. Then I want to move into the discussion on reality and what that has to do with what we've already talked about. This is, I think, a really important notion. I had never read this before until I encountered this paper. It doesn't get into reductionism. It gets into this idea of compression, which they say is the most important thing when you are coping with complex systems to be aware of. And I think the initial insight from this is similar to that of boundaries, in that things are getting left out, things are getting excluded, but it gets a little bit deeper than that. When they say that complex systems are incompressible, it is impossible to have an account of a complex system that is less complex than the system itself without losing some of its aspects. So in our terms, it is impossible to have a frame of a complex system that is less complex than the system itself without losing some of its aspects, or a description that is less complex than the system itself without losing some of its aspects. So they're saying the only way to like truly capture the complexity at hand is to like hold a mirror up to it, right? That would be the only way that you could truly capture the complexity. So we have to be aware of the fact that we are sort of putting it in a vise a little bit and compressing it and making it smaller so that we can fit it in our description and have a useful functional frame. But we lose some of this complexity. And I don't think that this is a call for having a bigger computer or a better human being, because I think you would still end up with a mirror image of that system itself if they could handle that much complexity. At some point, a subject needs to intervene and make a judgment about that to make it useful and go forward. So one of the insights that is I've been toying around with on this slide is this notion that I'm calling severance. So we talked boundaries, leaving things in and out, adding things, making them wider and such forth. But this idea of severance happens when we talk about Fritjof Capra's network of relations that's extending in all directions. When we have agents that are in our system, we are twisting the top of the vise. And as we do that, we are severing connections that extend outside of our system. And those connections may be very important. An agent in a system, we could call a human, defines itself against what it is towards, such as I am part of this political party, I am a part of this religion, these are my hobbies, this is where I live, as well as what they are against. I am not a part of this political party, I do not do this, I do not do that. So this idea of identity is also like a network. And as we compress this in some way, we lose how that identity is produced. We're not able to see it clearly. And the same thing goes when we start talking about work and work tasks and stuff that we do at work. Everything that we do is in some way has its purpose, has its function through its relationship with other work tasks and functions and outcomes such as products and services. And we lose some of that functionality, some of that purpose when we start severing some of these connections, some of which may be important, some of which may be not. So the takeaway there is that there is this breakage of meaning. We lose, it's not just context, it's how the things in the system generate meaning as themselves. So this is just going to close out this section with one last Cilliers quote. He says, "We cannot know a complex thing in all its complexity. We reduce the complexity in order to be able to say something about it within the finite means of our comprehension." So when we talk about compression, when we talk about boundaries, when we talk about losing temporal horizon, when we talk about all the things that have been sort of maybe cast in like a potentially or heard in a negative light so far, those are just the neutral, inevitable effects of being human. Is we have to do these things as we're moving from everything, like complete requisite variety, to a frame. We have no choice but to cast some of these things away, compress the system, make it smaller, generate a partial complex system that is only sort of one aspect of a larger autonomous entity. So letting our descriptions do this, they move us from the general to the particular. And as I sort of already went over in the last slide, is you don't necessarily, this is not a call for bigger humans and bigger computers, because at some point we have to do this convergent process of moving from everything to a thing, a frame, something from the general to the particular. So this is going to be interesting, or a bit of a trip, perhaps. Hopefully more on the interesting side. Everything we have said so far has involved the subject. The subject has been at the center of everything that has been going on thus far. There is an ongoing authorship of the frames that we create. We are creating frames. We are describing systems in certain ways. We generate frames through which we see partial complex systems, and we engage with them on the basis of these frames. So Marin here is saying something that I think is pretty important, is that there is the subject is involved in the isolation definition of a system. There's always decision and choice. There's always the subject doing something. And the subject intervenes in the definition of a system. So there is some part of this is becoming subjective. There's subjectivity in the creation of frames and in the seeing of systems and the sharing frames with other people. There is the role of the subject. So this is a bit of a Humberto Maturana deep track. You may have come across this, you may have not. It's not in any of his books, The Tree of Knowledge, Autopoiesis and Cognition. You only get to it in the late 80s when he starts getting really philosophical. I've heard but not been able to confirm that at some point Varela and Maturana both had schooling in continental philosophy, mainly the work of Martin Heidegger. I haven't been able to confirm, but if so, it makes a lot of sense because their work, especially his work in the 1980s, the paper this comes from, is very, very philosophical and very, very much similar to the work in Heidegger's Being and Time, which is a little interesting aside there for you. So what this slide is trying to communicate and what Maturana is trying to communicate is that there are two attitudes or pathways towards understanding reality, which I think is very interesting. And I want to draw your attention to the titles, the labels he's given these pathways. The one on the left is purely objective. It is a purely objective standpoint to take towards reality. The one on the right is objectivity in parentheses, and it is moving towards subjectivity. But Maturana doesn't want to say the word subjective. He doesn't want to say the word subjectivity. He doesn't really say it in any of his work, except when being interviewed in the book, The Biology of Cognition. And he doesn't want to say it for the same reason that Edgar Morin doesn't want to say it, which is he writes that subjectivity has become the opposite of masculinity. It has become feminine. And of course, he's talking about a very broken society when he says these things. But he's saying that subjectivity has become a problem. It's something you don't want to be. Maturana writes that if something has been labeled subjective, people are trying to eschew that. They're trying to move away from that. They don't want to be subjective. They want to be as objective and right as possible. And I think science wants to be as objective as possible, but in our daily living, I think many of us do as well, and sort of stay away from this idea of subjectivity. So he doesn't want to use that word at all, at risk of his work being devalued because it's talking about subjectivity. So these are two pathways, both doing very, very different things. On the pathway of objectivity without parentheses, he writes that what exists is independent of what one does. Reality and the systems in it are out there. They are pre-given. So when we inhabit this pathway towards reality, systems exist completely independent of what we do. We do not have any role in constituting the complex systems that we interact with. They're just out there. This pathway sort of seeks subjection and negation. That's the emotional tonality here. If you have the privileged access to one reality, you know that you're right. You've maybe done some research. You hold in you hold in your mind this one real reality, the one way things are. You want to push aside people whose sort of views conflict with you. And one of the best places to see this play out is in Facebook comments, really, over the past 4 years in particular. So there is this privileged access to one reality, and sort of you negate everyone else's who is around you. So there is this interesting last part that we're going to get to towards the end. I want to talk about explanations a little bit. Explanations of experience in this pathway, so how we explain what we have experienced, are validated by things that exist independently of us. So it's God, it's matter, it's physics, it's something that exists out there that is independent of us that we can use as a referent. It's not ourselves, it's things that we believe to exist independently of us. So that, I think, is one place you can inhabit if you're working around complex systems. The one I think that is a little bit more friendly to this notion of frames and friendly to this notion of seeing systems is objectivity in parentheses, and also known as constitutive ontologies, because the world that we inhabit is constituted by us. We create it, we develop it. So what exists is dependent on what one does. We are the source of reality to include the systems that are in it. And we do this through language. And that's going to be the subject of the next slide. So in this particular pathway of reality, we seek cooperation and enjoyment with others. We seek to see what their sort of reality is, because there are numerous possible realities, to see what it is that they've come up with. Cooperate with them, enjoy their presence. Maturana later calls this love. He has this notion of love, which is the existence of others is legitimate. It's very simple. That's what he calls love. The existence of others is legitimate. So you can see that sort of playing out here in bullet number 2. And he says that because of constitutive ontologies, because we are creating the world around us, there are numerous possible realities. And I think that for many people, including myself, when I first sort of got into this literature, that's a huge problem, because how would we ever get anything done? How are you going to function in a world where everyone can have their own reality and see their own systems, and, you know, people will be running amok? So Maturana answers that years and years later and says that this numerous possible realities thing isn't infinite. He says that the task of working together and living together and this being together actually delimits or constrains how many numerous possible realities there are, because we have to perform tasks together. We have to be able to do things together. So he says every human being is different, but not that different. So you can have deviations of a shared reality, but they're not completely different. So we share realities through coupling with one another, through work, through living together, and such forth, relationships. So this will become important in a little bit too. Explanations of experience here, explanations of our experiences of systems and their behavior, are constructed out of the coherences of our experience and validated by one's listening. So we explain something through the means of our experience, and we validate whether that's true or not through our listening. Through this, Maturana says it's a generally implicit criteria, which could be mood, mood, emotion. It could be anything that says, yes, I accept that explanation, that is valid, or no, it is not. And this works also if we're not only if we're explaining to ourselves, but if someone is explaining to us and saying, this is happening because of X and X, and we listen to that and we say, no, that's not valid, and we wait for them to reformulate it until we hear it as being valid. So this is the key. I think one of the key insights here is this idea of moving from the experience of separation to connectedness. And I want to get into that with this discussion of language here. We want to move from feeling completely separate from these systems and these frames to feeling connected to them, to feeling as if we are the source of those things. They're not out there, they're not arbitrary, that we have literally authored them and brought them into being. So this is a great slide, a great quote from Maturana. Maturana's whole deal later in life is that we live in language, and we function in language, and society sort of came to be. He has a book all about this. Society came into being through language, through communal living, through being with one another. And I think it's sort of a very applicable to what we are saying when he says that the very idea of something given and existing, and the very reference to some reality or truth, unavoidably involves language. So whatever we are able to say about that truth or reality is dependent upon the availability of language. What is supposedly independent from us becomes describable only when language is available. So he's actually arguing a point here, and he's saying that only what is spoken about exists. And he's sidestepping this argument maybe about solipsism and realism. Is he's sidestepping it, and he's saying all we have to really realize and recognize is that we construct our worlds through language. That is how we sort of create the world around us, is through language. So, and he goes on later and says, what is said can under no condition be separated from the human being saying it. There is no division between the speaker and what is spoken. The observer is necessarily the origin and source of everything. So this is a bit of an extremist view, but I think it softens a little bit as you think about it and see that we are maybe living in language, and that to have spoke for something to exist, someone has to have either read it to us or we have to have spoken it. It's a very interesting perspective. I don't agree with it all the time, but I agree with it enough to bring it up now and to say that language is both an enabling and a governing constraint to the creation of frames, if that makes sense. So what happens is the language that we have available to us allows us to create certain frames. If we are a apprentice, the language available to us to create a frame is actually quite limited. So the language that we do have allows us to make X number of frames, but the language we don't have it governs our ability to make certain frames. So it's sort of enabling us on one hand, but governing us on the next. Now, if we're a journeyman or a master, we have in our field, we have more languages available to us through our linguistic capacity, so that the governing force of language has been lessened, and we can create more frames that might not be able to be created by those who are newer in the field. So I think I like to think of language in this way of sort of enabling us to do something, but in some cases constraining us to do something. So Maturana writes that even when grappling with the problem whether there exists an observer-independent reality out there somewhere, we need language for a discussion of that sort, which is kind of a bit of a mic drop by Maturana, who is saying, even if you are going to have this discussion, you have to realize that you're using language. So you can't really escape the fact that language is fundamental to our being, and it's fundamental to our creation of frames. So this has been a long work in progress, and I want to go through it with you here. This is called an operation of distinction. This is Maturana's most fundamental function that you can perform in language. It is the basis of our world. When he writes about constitutive ontologies, he's writing about the fact that as we bring a system into being, we are doing that through an operation of distinction. And when looking at this and sort of looking at Maturana and Paul Cilliers and looking at Keith Storr's book on frame innovation, this operation of distinction that is being performed really resonates with that work. So it begins with this sort of background of everything, this complete holism that we've been moving around, where there is just complete requisite variety. We use our experience, what he calls our experiential coherences, but what is sufficient to understand as our experience, our background, to specify a bounded area of agents and relations in a particular here and now within a confined area. And we then we have this circle back here, we have this boundary with some sort of inclusion criteria, and then we demarcate it from the background and bring it forth. And in doing so, we hang properties, history, context, and significance, and then we end up at a frame. We have sort of moved from everything to a particular frame. This is a more advanced way of building on that visualization that was used earlier, in that there are properties, excuse me, and that we are nevertheless tied to it through the operation of distinction. So there's this interesting thing he's trying to say. He's trying to get us to move from the experience of separation to the insight of connectedness. And he's trying really hard to do that. So he's saying that once we have brought a system into being, a frame into being, it is tied to us and it has changed who we are. We have become part of this. It has become part of our living. So even though you experience it as being separate from us, as not a part of this, you have been the source of that. You have brought it into being and it is now tied to you. And as you go about the course of your living, it is sort of affecting you and being one with you. And if we reflect on this, if we're observers, which Maturana uses that term a lot, if we reflect on what we do, Maturana says we will see that nothing exists separate from us, and that's the move from feeling like things exist out there to seeing things in the domain of objectivity with parentheses. So I want to expand what we've been talking about quite a bit and move and expand this notion of frames. So I want to do that in a few different steps. And the first one is we have descriptions of a system. Those are the distinctions we just walked through, where we pull something out from the one system and move it into our language so that we can speak about it. So we could use, for example, we could say, to use another example from my neck of the woods, the wildland fire management system is unable to cope with current fire season, which is more or less true if you look abroad. But then I want to add the experience of our experiences of partial complex systems, the experiences of the systems our frames have created, and say something to the effect of, if the form always is, if X and X happens, then the result will be such and such. Or because X and X happens, the result has been such and such. Because of a warmer and drier climate, wildfire activity has increased. So we can couple these explanations to these descriptions and make much richer frames that allow us to sort of describe it on one level, but also sort of explain a little bit of that system behavior that we're seeing and give us something a little firmer to hang our hat on. So this is something we've already talked about a little bit. The first part of this quite long quote is that we use the regularities of our seeing, our touching, and our measuring. So those are the coherences of our experience. It's very confusing language, but essentially what he's saying is, if we look back over all of your experience, there are certain coherences and regularities that have taken place that make sense, that you use in your daily life. And we use those to describe or present what we want to explain. So we have, in order to explain something, we must first have to have distinguished it. So as we have distinguished it and we have described it, we then use those same operational coherences, those same experiential coherences of our seeing, touching, and measuring to propose the formal condition that will be our explanatory proposition. And I'm going to get into that right now. So this took a long time. To get this shape. It's been interesting. I haven't really, it used to be just a feedback loop, but then I realized it needed to be something more. I've shared it maybe once or twice before, and it's not my best drawing, but far from my worst. So how explaining works is we start within experience, and then we go sort of up the loop, and we propose an explanatory proposition, which is the process or mechanism, the thing responsible for the experience in question. It is the, if such and such, then the result will be such and such. It's the first part of that. It's the causal mechanism that is producing what it is that we are experiencing. So we propose an explanatory proposition, then we go around the loop to our listening, right? Generally implicit, sometimes explicit, but its criteria for accepting explanatory propositions includes a couple different factors, but they change, so it doesn't necessarily matter what they are, as long as we recognize that it is our listening. So right here, and I don't think I could make this much clearer, we are at the center of our reality. We are using, and we have encountered an experience that we are explaining through our past experience that we are then validating through our own listening. So we are squarely in the pathway of objectivity with parentheses. That is where we live. That is where we exist. I think, or where we should exist or be aware of that we are existing in when we are dealing with complex systems, because we are such the authors of our reality, and they are not sort of arbitrary, let's say, objectively existing entities. Okay, so, wow, I moved through that faster than I intended to. I'm really hoping that was intelligible. So, principles of framing complex systems. I have 7. I'd like to maybe whittle this down to 3 someday, but I thought 7 was a good starting point. I couldn't squeeze out 8 for some reason. So the first thing I think we need to do when it comes to framing complex systems is to consider the sense-making operations that came before the current frame. Something had to have taken place in order for there to have been something that you can frame. And I'm not entirely sure yet what that is. I think a lot of it is perceptual. Maturana gets into the ganglion cells of the eye and how they see edges of things when looking at a frog's eye, for instance. There's other work to be done here on these like non-deliberate, unintentional frames that we then stack on top of our intentional work. So I think the first thing is to consider those operations and be aware that something happened before the frame that we're sort of trying to produce, and that we can go back and revisit that and change that if we've so wanted to. So there's this next one that is very meaningful to me. It's take nothing for granted. Take nothing for granted refers to compression, refers to boundaries, refers to what is left out of systems. There is what out of systems, it's really, you don't know what is important is also sort of the subtext here. So take nothing for granted. In my sort of experience and in what I've come across so far, and even my own life, I think the take nothing for granted is an overwhelming caution label. I think it's almost a bias for inaction in some instances. I think it is a warning, to be hesitant, to be a little maybe afraid is too strong of a word, but I think we can take this and make it into something that we could be almost aggressive with. We're going to aggressively take nothing for granted. We're going to go out there and continue to put our frames into practice and see if they come back all messed up or not, or if arbitrary systems are flowing out of them. So we can be aggressive about this. We don't necessarily have to stand back, but it's more of how we interact. Take nothing for granted can be a disposition. Language and experience enable and govern the creation of frames. Language enables us to make frames. The language we don't have governs those that we cannot make. Experience is the same way. We use our experience to sort of generate frames very early on, as well as explain our experiences of that which has been distinguished. So they both act as enabling and governing forces. 4, move from the experience of separation to the insight of connectedness. I think it's really important to see ourselves as being the source of our worlds, the source of our frames, and see that we are connected to them, that they are sourced from us. I think that gives a little bit of authorship, a little bit of agency into how they are created, how they are recreated, and how they are understood. They are understood as being products of ourselves. And this flows neatly into number 5, which is to communicate frames with an awareness of whether they are being shared from the pathway of objectivity with parentheses or without. So in these domains, we have the left side being objectivity and the right side being some sort of subjectivity. If you were in the domain of subjectivity, of objectivity, you are certain you are right, or you want others to perform certain actions, or you want to gain control. I think about this as like a domain I would move into if I wanted to perform or embrace the early Cynefin dynamic of imposition of order, of moving from chaos to the simple domain there, the clear domain, I believe. And that is exactly what we would do. We would be in that domain to grab a hold of the situation, but you have to know that you're not interested in engaging with those who are around you. It is something that you were putting out there, and it's not really a discussion item. Inversely, if we are in the domain of objectivity without parentheses, with parentheses or without parentheses, you are looking to hear from your interlocutors and other observers and engage and see what parts of your frame might not be operable in certain instances. So we need to be aware of this. Lastly, be critical of the spatiotemporal boundaries introduced by frames. Frames create boundaries. Those boundaries may only be good for so long. I was giving a talk at the beginning of COVID way back, and said something very similar to this, that any boundary that you may have, or as you're saying, any story that you may be telling may only be good for about a day. And it turns out, maybe half a day was the right answer. And that's the same thing here. You may have to change your boundaries. You may have to change your descriptions. You may have to change what your descriptions take into consideration. Lastly, you're going to want to revisit explanations constantly. Always be revisiting explanations because they are causal, because they establish causal connections, and causality is something that is inherently problematic in complex systems. Causality is generally, you can see that retrospectively. You can sort of, you can see causality, X equals Y in retrospect, but you can't see it when you're sort of trying to explain something that's happening in the passing present. It gives you something to hang your hat on to say X is happening because of Y, so we should do T. But it doesn't necessarily, that's not necessarily going to hold up over time. So those explanations that are at the basis of your action will need to be revisited quite frequently. So now I want to end up here with, I think, ideas of flow. This is the last slide. I think, yes, it is. I want to just sort of talk about what new language we might use for generating frames. And this comes from, first it comes from from within the work of Maturana. on domains of structural determinism, if that is something that is familiar to you, but that's not necessarily something you need to know of to see this. So you have these different domains, and these different domains see different threats, and they respond to them in different ways. So you can sort of frame your system that you work in as being in the domain of robustness, because the possible interactions that you may encounter within your landscape at any given moment may trigger no changes or only subtle changes in operations. So it's a variation. There's little variation there. So we can this is one of the early ways that we can use this sort of matrix here for understanding framing. Then you move on to the flow portion, which is in the domain of adaptive capacity. You can frame your system as being in this domain if interactions can trigger changes in how we produce our identity, but not what our identity is. So that's sort of the frame, and that's the explanation. Now we get to sort of this idea of flow, which is that in the domain of adaptive capacity, we change how we produce our identity, but not what our identity is. The flow comes from the inflows into the system. So we bring in different inflows that allow us that change in how our identity is produced, but not what our identity is. So we are pulling new things into the system, say new supply chains, new information, new theories in use, new types of personnel, anything you can really quite come up with that doesn't change what the identity is, but does change how the identity is being produced. Then there is, I think this is another frame, the domain of transformation. So we are headed to this or near this when all the possible interactions we might experience across our landscape can trigger changes in our identity and how we produce it. So there are changes in what our identity is, as well as the flows that produce it. So we have different inflows, different outflows, meaning products and services. Different things are flowing in and out of the system, as are the processes, the socio-technical processes that transform one into the other. So does that make sense? There's this broad spectrum change that is triggering who we are as an organization, as a team, as a department, that changes what our identity is and the flows we use to produce it, both in and out. And then lastly, there's the domain of dissolution, where possible interactions that trigger, where all the interactions in our environment, or a interaction, can cause a disintegration in our identity and how it is produced. So that's sort of the death knell there. That's when it's over. Maybe that's the private equity firm days. That's when things haven't gone too well. But I'll read this quote. Maturana says later, it's so interesting to see how his work has changed from the 80s all the way up until now, the late 80s. If the organization of the system is not conserved while its structure changes, the system disintegrates as a case of the original class, and something else appears in its place. So we can use this as a frame. If we could die, our organization could disintegrate, but we could also come back into the domain of transformation and create into the domain of transformation and create something new. Now, I was reading Maturana and sort of reading from the new Cynefin book at the same time when coming up with a lot of this. So there is sort of a Cynefin-y feel to it, which is unavoidable almost. And when you're dealing with complexity, I feel like. But this is this has been presented as a way of creating new language for generating frames, of thinking about things in terms of robustness, adaptive capacity, transformation, dissolution, with the possibility to enter back into domains of transformation and then adaptive capacity and then back to robustness. So there's this idea of things falling apart but coming back together at the last minute. And then we have, let's see, what's next? Yes, a reference list. And it seems my annotations have stayed on the screen, which I wasn't expecting. Cool. I'm going to come out of presenter mode, if that's all right. And we'll see what we got.
Woo, that was great. Thank you so much, Greg.
Thank you. Well, thank you for having me. I wasn't, presenter mode is always difficult. It's difficult to tell how it's going.
Well, I mean, if you're willing to stick with us, we'd like to open the floor up to questions. So based on my very poor vision, if you raise your hand, I will try to call on you, or you could just put in chat, I have a question, and unmute you, and then I'll ask you to unmute yourself and ask your question. So I see that Jim Karp has raised his hand, but first I'll ask Jocko if he has any questions.
No, I'm still digesting that, so I'll throw it out to the group.
Okay, well then, Jim.
So first, just want to say thank you. That was an amazing romp through a whole bunch of thinking. Much of it new to me. The part where you most lost me, I'm hoping we might be able to go back to and you could give an example, and that is the explaining experience diagram.
Okay.
Perhaps if you get meta here and explain something while tracing through what we're doing there, that would be helpful.
Okay. Yeah. So a bit of background, explaining becomes a big part of Maturana's work from like 1988 onward. And it becomes a key sort of portion to how people live their life. And he also sort of views science as an explanation, like a big explanation. So what happens is this. We have an experience that we call into question. The only thing that comes to mind is kind of somber, but I guess I'll use it. I was a firefighter for a few years. It was awesome. I was around while I was a firefighter. We lost 19 firefighters in one sitting out in Arizona. You may remember, U.S. Arizona. And we still sort of question that a lot about how that was able to happen and how that was produced. So that is the experience that we are trying to explain, the loss of 19 firefighters. And then we generate an explanatory proposition. And we say, well, if they left the safety zone, then they would have died the way that they did. And then, so that's step 2. That's the creation of the formal condition, also known as the explanatory proposition. So we have sort of introduced a causal statement that says, that moves from, this happened because of such and such. So there's a cause. And what he wants to say, what he wants you to know is that you're listening, and that criteria is implicit or explicit. It has to do with your mood. Has to do with your your emotions, which are different to Maturana. It has to do with the actions that the explanatory proposition will produce, would produce if you were to follow it. It's anything really. It's multifaceted. So then, if you accept that proposition on the basis of what you've heard, then you sort of exit that loop, and it becomes part of your life. It's collapsed on there, and you don't have to think about it again. Another sort of more practical example, I guess, that just came to mind is Maturana uses so it becomes part of his living, and he doesn't have to question it again for quite some time. Is that helpful?
So where I get a little confused is, well, what if I'm not quite sure who's listening.
Okay, yeah, I got you.
So
So there's two kinds, right? Right now you're listening to me, and I'm trying to explain to you how explaining works, and you're accepting it or not accepting it, which is just how conversation works. But it's also you and I speaking to ourselves, and I think that's the kind of explaining that I'm talking about. Is we explain things to ourselves. Well, if I do this, the result will be such and such, and I accept that because I'm looking out for my own interests, right? So we are listening, but sometimes we are being explained to, other times we are explaining to ourselves, or we are explaining to others.
okay, thank you for going through that. I see there's other questions, so let's.
Oh no, it's good to talk about.
Okay, well, A Rebo has their hand raised. There we go.
How you doing? It's definitely the most sober I've been for one of these, so that's good. Yeah, I guess so it actually very similar to some of the stuff I've read. It's interesting, all different authors, but sort of very similar conclusions. Just from a sort of like philosopher standpoint, I mean, obviously there's like Kant in there with his nomina and phenomena. Then there's Foucault, who speaks a lot about how we describe things sort of through sort of generations, and how sort of those frames affect how we think of it, all the way through to sort of Deleuze, who talks about identity stemming from the environment and not the other way around, which I think sort of ties in very closely to what you had at the end. So just sort of three philosophers that came to mind as you were going through that. But the question I had, something that I've also thought about, is I was interested about your sort of shared experience. So if you forgive me for using subjectivity out of habit, sort of there is a sort of a sense that everybody has their own like value system, and value systems can be shared to some extent. And back in sort of the olden days / philosophy people these days, there was those old sort of guarantors of consensus, which is sort of religion, and sort of provided a basis of which to sort of have a commonality. But I was just interested, so what were you reading around that, and can you go a little bit more into sort of how you see almost like a shared subjectivity, for want of a better phrase?
Yeah, so most of what my touchstone on that has been Maturana's own words. In a book that's like really hard, I think it's hard to get a hold of now. It's called From Being to Doing, the Biology of Cognition. It's an interview style book, which is really cool for people who are into Maturana, because he's actually like put on the spot a few times. And that is one of the places he's put on the spot. But he gets into it and he says, hey, you know, the person who's the interviewer is saying to him, you know, isn't your position sort of suggesting that there are infinite realities? And he's saying, well, the case is that there's had to have been or needs to be communal living. And he goes as far as to say in another book that you wouldn't have had early civilization without shared reality. You wouldn't have had people who could have hunted together. You wouldn't have had, I mean, now things are quite different, I think, on our independence. But at that point in history, you know, and its evolution, he's saying, you know, you couldn't have had people who were even agrarian to that extent. So that my touchstone is deep within Maturana of him just saying, you know, maybe you could have, you know, X number of billion realities, but a lot of them are shared. So I don't have like a philosophical touchstone for that. It's more of just my studies of Maturana, who is certainly a biologist turned philosopher.
Right. Okay, cool. Awesome. Thanks.
Great. Justin has his hand up.
Thank you. I recently had the opportunity to read Berger and Luckman's Social Construction of Reality, and found a lot of similarities from what you had talked about, particularly in relation to how reality is perceived, particularly for the example you gave on objectivity in parentheses, how it becomes more of a connected view of reality versus something that's separated from the person and their relationships and their values. And also around language, because they make a specific emphasis towards our language really helping us to define what we see as reality. So I was just interested to learn in your research and the work that you've done, how much has sociology played into our framing of complex systems? Is it, you know, marginal, or is it really significant as we look at this topic?
So I haven't done very much around that, to be upfront about it. I haven't really looked at that. My social component that I think I touched upon the most this evening, vis-a-vis like how much complexity you can fit in a description and give to somebody else, like how much transmission capacity is there. So I think that's probably the extent of what I have touched upon so far. I think that there's probably a lot of room to take that, especially when you start talking about, like, you know, the sociology of work teams, work cultures, and in power relations too. If you're following a strategy to frame a complex system, it behooves us to know, you know, who has the authority to say what that strategy is, who has the authority to say what frame is acceptable, and who has the authority to say, you know, when and where framing will take place. So I haven't gotten into it too much, Justin, to be honest. Mostly just sort of staying around these philosophical readings, but I think that would be a really interesting place to take it. Have we lost him?
No, I'm still here. Thank you. That's a perfect response. Thank you.
Thanks.
Great. Okay. Bao has his hand up. Go, Bao.
Thank you. Thank you, Greg, for really stimulating presentation. I'm not so well versed with the works of Maturana, but I've done some study on him. I've actually two questions. The first one is, I got first introduced to systems theory through the works of Russell Eckhoff. At least he was one of them. And so he's not a complex system scientist. But one of the things that he said is one of the first things you need to do, and this is relating to when you talk about creating a frame, is you need to do synthesis before you do analysis.
Mhm.
And so he would say, look at the problem that you have at hand. In what system does it fit? And is there a super system, etc.? And
Sure.
The TRIS approach has the same thing. Can you say something more about what you have learned in your studies about making frames, etc., about the role of synthesis and analysis, sequencing, and all that?
Sure. So I think that I think one comes before the other. I think there is that like autonomic type of framing that I was talking about that happens. I think I haven't gone too far into it. It's just a wormhole rabbit hole I know that exists, and eventually will do a talk on it. There's this something predates our intentional framing process. So once you have framed a system or maybe created this partial complex system, I'm loving that language. You then have the opportunity to dive in through synthesis and then come up through analysis, right? And it depends what you're doing that for. You may, if you're for a design process, for a problem solving, for supporting decision making, a description of the system may be good enough to get you going. For a problem solving, I would think, given, I love Ackoff, by the way. He was one of my first reads as well. I own one of his books, The Best of Ackoff, which is a great read. And I think that synthesis portion plays a bigger role when you start talking about problem solving, about diving into the partial complex system the frame has created, and then coming back out.
Okay.
I think that's the best I got on that one. That's a really good question.
Yeah, thank you. I have another question, but I want to yield the floor if there's somebody else.
I don't think so.
I think you're good to go, Val.
Okay. The second thing that I like to talk about or hear your comments about is about the availability of language, right? And because in some certain languages are more rich to describe things than other languages. But there is something else that predates a language that human beings have always had, which is feelings. And feelings are an emergent property of our biological organism, and can heavily influence how we create frames. Because if we are all afraid, and you have a bunch of virologists in the room, and there is this pandemic breaking out, and it's all happening around them, when you have fear, that significantly influences how you can think and what you can think, et cetera, et cetera. Have you come anything across how they look at feelings? Because I'm surprised that it was only language, but there is also feelings, and that's the essence of human beings is feelings.
Yeah. So if I really wanted to do it, I could have brought in Maturana's work on emotion and mood, which are different to him. Emotion and mood are different. I think that the appearance of mood in my work this evening was based on what domain we're in of reality, of objectivity or subjectivity, that there is a feeling of I need others to listen to me because I'm right and I know what I'm talking about, and I need them to follow this frame. So if you create a frame in that pathway, you are going to you're doing it with the intent of having others yield to your sort of command, right? Which in some situations isn't necessarily wrong. Like if there's a lot going on, if you're in the middle of an incident or at the beginning of an incident and there's sort of like chaos taking place, like someone needs to do something at some point. So I think that is a very, that's the emotional tonality, the feeling of creating frames from that pathway. When you move over to constitutive ontologies, objectivity with parentheses, you get more of like, there's the emotion of love, Maturana calls it, the other's existence is legitimate. So you want to share and you want to see how other frames are desirable or undesirable, or which parts are not operable. So there is this feeling thing that's built into these domains of reality. And that's why I think we need to be aware of which one we are inhabiting when we're trying to communicate a frame. Like, are you looking for someone? If you're looking to say, this is the frame, here is what I've created, are you looking for someone to talk, or are you looking for someone to do something? I think that there's a deeper avenue that we could take. As I think you mentioned fear, we could step outside of Maturana's domains and say, oh, you know, we're afraid, so we're going to frame this in a way that has a bias for inaction. Or we're trying to do something, so we're going to frame this for a bias for action. When we start talking, you know, wildfires are something that I like to talk a lot about. If we're framing a wildfire, we have generally the agencies who are responsible for that will frame it as a fire that needs to be put out, to go get, and not one that we're going to let burn to fulfill some natural ecological processes. Not to insult any one of these agencies or not, but that's just the frame, and that's the world we live in. So there is this, you know, bias for action and fear that it will become out of control if we let it do its thing. So I do think that feelings become a part of frames, and even deeper at the autonomic level, I think they play an even larger role that we're not aware of.
Yeah. Thank you. Last question from me about transmissibility. So, in the notion that we have bounded rationality, we cannot completely model the whole system. What tools have you come across where that are trying to actually increase the transmissibility of how you try to frame a system? I'm particularly asking because I'm working in a group with Tris, where they have something that's called a problem formulator, where they actually create a systems diagram that then also can begin to create hypotheses and directions for potential solution domains. Of course, solution domains between quotation marks, because you're in a complex domain, you just move to another pattern. But I was just wondering what other tools you've come across.
Just a lot of what I've come across is in reading about generating something that is going to create, that's going to be able to function at a higher level than the human brain. I think there's a lot to be said for systems dynamics, like the work of John Sterman and Danella Meadows before she was lost way too early as well. That I think try to model a great deal of complexity with stock and flow diagrams.
Yeah.
And I think they get there. I think they're immensely useful. But I guess maybe I haven't been around them long enough, or maybe worked with them enough to see or know that like how close they get. But they're definitely an attempt to try to get there. Whereas I think I'm more like linguistic based. I'm more focused around and centered around like what do we actually do in the course of our living? Do we sit down and like open up, what is it, Stella, for the making the diagrams, or are we talking with one another and creating frames and moving from there? So I'm focused on that. I did have some friends who were working in the humanitarian field for the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative, an acquaintance, maybe I should say. And they had a toolkit that was AI based that looked at like theories of correlation and all that. And that might have gotten very close. But that sticks out as one tool that people were using.
Okay, thank you.
Just building on that idea of tools, there's this idea of there's millions of realities, there's not an infinite number, and there's overlap between realities. And I'm really intrigued by this. How do we find those intersections, right? How do we find the the common realities that allow us to then hunt together, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think you just said it. I think you said it. It's if you see hunting together, there is intersections of realities. If you see people working together, there are intersections of realities. If you see marriage, sometimes you see intersections of realities. So I think that anytime you see this like communal living and working together, there has to be an intersection of realities. There has to be.
Oh no, certainly that's evidence that intersection has occurred. The question
Sure.
is how can you encourage more of that? How do you enter a system and get more of that and less of the hunting independently?
Yeah, so I think the example or the line I would use is looking at different realities and seeing parts where portions of realities aren't operable and portions of reality aren't desirable, and looking at how people got there. And desirability we can probably measure, probably quite subjectively, from the basis of communal living, like what is keeping us from being a team, what is keeping us from working and hunting and gathering together. And it's looking at the realities that are in that sphere and then seeing where they diverge and talking about those divergent points and talking about where they come from and why they're desirable and where they're not desirable, to at least get understanding of these different realities and that they exist, and acknowledging them. And I think that might move you closer to that. But there's definitely, I know what you're talking about, and there's definitely a lot of that, an opportunity to look at these, I think the divergent, like orthogonal angles, and talk about them would be one direction to take that.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. We could probably talk about that for
For
days,
hours.
but I see
Yeah,
see
but I'm not going to let you.
but Barbara's not going to let us.
I'm not going to
because
let you.
our realities, Barbara's reality is divergent from
Because
my
there are
reality.
other questions, and Meetup is so helpful. It sends me messages like participants have raised their hands, but that doesn't tell me who they are. So Thanis, you have raised your hand.
Thank you. Thank you, Greg, for that presentation. I was just wondering, and it binds a bit to what we were discussing before, the language issue. Could language itself be a frame through which we already look at things or try to solve things?
Yes. Yes, it is.
Because I'm thinking historically, many things that actually made people converge, and live together or work together or hunt together, were ineffable, and they were expressed as being ineffable. That's why it was the apophatic way of describing God, for example. What God is not what God is. So this is like a distinction between what can be used, what language can be used for, and there are other things that language cannot be used for. And these were the things that many times in history have kept people together. So what do you think about that?
I think there is, so it's almost like, to me, it's almost like a pre-linguistic position a little bit, or a sublinguistic position. And I liken it, again, I want to bring it back to this idea of these primordial frames that we create just in the course of our living that are unintentional, and then revisiting that language that was used beforehand, that was used to generate that frame. I think that language, as I said, enabling, governing, could become a frame. Is that what you mean? I'm trying to get there. I just want to make sure.
I'm just thinking that if we were in a meditation circle right now,
Yeah.
we would be framing the whole issue of multiple realities in a totally different way.
Yeah.
But we are in a discussion circle, so we frame it through language.
Yeah, I mean, that's a dissertation. I think a lot about that. If we were in a meditation circle, we'd be doing it many different ways. I don't think so. I think language is access to frames. I don't know if it would be a frame in and of itself, but an approach to the creation of frames.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, I think so. That's a big one.
Yeah, I mean, because I was thinking about how language is sometimes used to deliberately create a reality. You know, so that we have how we use language to define reality, describe reality, and sometimes we use it to create a reality that may or may not exist.
Mm-hmm. And we can do that, especially when we realize we're in the domain of constitutive ontologies. I think we can be quite intentional about that.
Or sometimes we even try to use language to solve the problems the language created. So that's like a
a double back. Yeah.
Yeah, this whole thing of language and reality is like that's a whole other meetup. we could do that. We could do a whole night on that. That's yeah.
So I have a question that keeps coming back to me in terms of framing, because when I hear it defined, it's one thing, but then when I hear the examples, I sort of hear another one. Can you? And oftentimes they seem rather static to me. Can you address the static or the dynamic nature of the framing? But particularly what I'm interested in is how that ties to, is framing just really a fancy way of categorizing?
I don't think framing is a fancy way of categorizing. I think it's a way of bringing something into life and describing it in a certain way so that it exists in that way as you're dealing with it. I think that frames create a lens. I think frames create a lens that we look through to deal with a system. So they dispose us towards a system. They dispose us towards a reality in a very particular way
Aren't you defining category, though? That's what I'm getting at. It all kind of circles back to a form of categorizing, it seems to me. You could say that it's a lens that enables you to categorize, or you can say it's a way of positioning an argument, but at the end of the day, they boil down to categories. And the reason I'm so obsessed with categories, I suppose, is the thing that I oftentimes mention is that once you categorize something or once you frame something, it is cognitively different or difficult to reframe it or to recategorize it, because then we begin to frame adjacent things based on that frame, or we categorize things based on the adjacent things that we're categorizing. It seeps through, and this starts to bleed into the whole idea of language, which is language is what the whole thing that ties it all together, that enables us not only A, to think it, but B, to express it.
Yeah, so I'm not entirely sure about I have my sort of take on categorization comes from, I wish I could remember, cognitive studies, 4E's cognition. So from that perspective, I think I'd agree that there's levels of categorization. And I suppose you could call a frame a category, but that would sort of imply that there are other frames in that category with it, or that by putting something in there, you've created like an attractor basin and more things are going to fall sort of into there. like you're saying. I'd be interested to see what the value of that is. Is it cautionary? Is it strategic? Where does that head?
Well, it's primarily in the concept that within organizations, many of these categories are deeply anchored. Something is anchoring them, that attractor basin that you're talking about. We're trying to break them, but we're oftentimes, you will see people that are trying to break them are coming in with their own strong anchors that they're using fancy language to just hide the fact that they're just other anchors. So in organizations, we're oftentimes, so in other words, when we'll go in and we'll bound something, we need to be very careful. So it is cautionary in that sense that the boundary we creating doesn't become a real boundary, because we know that what we're bounding is something that we're interested in looking at. So we can look at that smaller piece, that partial complexity that you were talking about. That's the usefulness of the boundary, but we know that the boundary doesn't exist. When we get into this anchoring and this framing, or the framing and the categorization problem, are those just anchors? Because usually we're trying to break those apart rather than establish them. Obviously, they're interacting with other frames and other categories. So I guess it's primarily cautionary.
Yeah, I think you can't really have enough cautionary tales around framing. Especially when it's something that you're going to have to do over and over again. So I think that there's value in that. I don't think Keys Doris would agree with categorization, maybe. But it's definitely a way of maybe taking this discussion a little bit further and saying that, so a frame, a description, and if we describe other things in that way, then they go in that bucket, right? But I think when you are reframing things constantly, you're going to get a lot of buckets, a pretty big, regime landscape.
And it's turtles all the way down too. So.
Yeah, so
you could be endlessly in the loop, right?
Yeah, totally.
Okay, Jocko, are you done?
Good talk.
Should we take a vote, or should I just stop talking?
You should just stop talking. Rebo, am I pronouncing your name correctly?
Yeah, Rebo. That's
Rebo. Okay.
Aaron.
You have the floor.
Thanks. I mean, I'm actually just sort of dovetailing with what Jocko was saying a second ago. I mean, my sort of understanding of like the way we frame is it's very much like anchored in our belief system. So what we value will inform how we frame it. And so other people's frames might very well be different, but they'll be anchored in their belief systems. And often when you get that sort of conflict, when two different sets of values are facing off against one another, and neither sort of side has taken the opportunity to understand, sort of what the other person is valuing, and sort of seek to find a way to sort of bridge that. As the eternal sort of hunter of the lose in this call, and always, like he has an idea that sort of the classification is like secondary to the conditions, but that is a whole other discussion. But I think the main thing I was wanting to say is that I think that the way we frame, from what I've seen, is very much anchored in what we value.
Yeah. So you're saying you were a little hard to hear, but what I did make out quite clearly, I think quite clearly at the end, was what we frame is anchored in what we value. I think that's right. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, is my sound bad? Okay. Sorry about
it was just a little muted is all, really. So I agree with you. It's in what we value, and I would put value there in the initial sort of definition. We describe a system in a certain way when we want to frame it. We frame a system in a certain way for a particular reason, and that reason could include quite easily values, strategies, expediency, power. So there's a lot of things that I think we can tuck onto there that are sort of motivating. or shaping this frame for a particular reason at a particular time. And I think that those can also shift. And I think that's where you might also get quite a bit of collision of realities that don't yet match up when you're trying to frame a system. But when we get talking about different realities and the pathway of objectivity with parentheses, you do get like the appearance of values and the appearance of other sort of aspects that are driving what it is we are bringing into being through our language.
Okay, Bao, you did have your hand up. Did you take it down? It's hard for me to tell from Meetup's interface here.
Take it down. I'm fine.
Okay,
Thank you.
Okay, no problem. All right. Any other questions before we wrap this up? Going once, going twice?
Huh?
Well, Greg, we really want to thank you so much for this. It's been awesome. You know, please come back anytime you have some stuff you want to work out.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd like to throw out there, I'm always looking to give a talk. So if anyone's interested in hearing this talk again or something like it, please don't be shy. Reach out on LinkedIn and or Twitter, and we'll definitely talk.
Yeah, anytime you have new material to work through, let us know. You know,
All right.
You always have a platform.
Thank
you so much. For those of you that are still with us, I have put the link to Greg's slide share in the chat. There was a couple of questions about the resource slide, and you can find it there on the slide share. So
Can we post that up on the meetup as well, Greg? Is that fine?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, cool.
The recording will be up in about a week, depending on Jocko's vacation schedule. It might be 2 weeks.
It might be longer because I do not have the home computer, the Mac, when I'm in Hawaii, so it'll have to wait, unfortunately.
Such a sad life for you. For those of you that stayed with us, thank you so much. For those of you in Europe, thank you for staying up into the middle of the night. I really admire you guys.
We applaud you. We applaud you.
Yeah.
Because I'm actually one of the co-hosts, and I wouldn't stay up until the middle of the night for this. So, thanks again, everyone, and we'll see you soon.
All right, awesome. Thanks again.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.